Hi everyone, in this lesson I'll be speaking about Burgmüller's Etudes Opus 109, at least about some of them. These etudes are actually a great alternative to etudes by Karl Czerny, for example. Burgmüller was a 19th century German composer that moved to Paris actually in 1832, around the time when Frédéric Chopin did. And the attitude towards the genre of etude changed a lot in the 19th century. Composers treated etudes simply as technical exercises, so many of them were not actually very interesting from the artistic perspective. And this is the reason why many of them are actually boring to play, honestly. But in the 19th century, many composers started to think about etudes as of also artistic pieces. So they tried to make them beautiful and they tried to make them meaningful. The pioneers, the brightest pioneers of this movement were, of course, Frédéric Chopin and Franz Liszt. But many other composers, including Burgmüller, also followed the trend. So although each of these studies is very useful in order to develop particular piano skills, but nevertheless, these pieces are actually very charming. And many of them have very poetic and very interesting titles, so you immediately recognize the story behind the music and also might enrich your interpretation. Let's start from the etude number 6 in C major for double notes. This etude helps you to master a very common piano skill with double notes when you have a wider interval first and then a narrower interval. And that pattern is actually very, very wide used in the music, in romantic music, for example, like Schumann's toccata. Or, for example, in the Beethoven's Concerto number 5, there is also a passage that features exactly same pattern. And even in the modern music, actually, composers like Karol Szymanowski, for example, has used this pattern in his Symphony number 4 for piano solo and orchestra, and there is a passage that sounds like. So that, of course, sounds already more modern with a lot of dissonances, but nevertheless, that's the same pattern actually. So that's why learning an etude like this is very reasonable, because you will most probably need this pattern if you will play a lot of music. And actually this pattern is much simpler and much more comfortable to play than, for example, double thirds. So this etude has a title, Light-Hearted Maiden. Actually very romantic and very charming. And in order to master these structures, we have to learn just one movement, but very important one. Using one wrist movement for the pair of chords. So on the first one, on the wider one, you go down with your wrist, kind of going inside the keys. And when you play the narrower interval, you go up with your wrist, kind of pushing off the keyboard. So you go in the keyboard and out of the keyboard. It's reasonable to play first using legato for these two chords, so connecting them, leaning on the first interval and pushing off the keyboard on the second one. And you're not actually using your fingers so much, but rather the forearm that goes up and pushing off the wrist. So the motion comes really from the wrist, not just from the fingers. Otherwise you will get very tired pretty quickly. And then as soon as you feel comfortable playing that using legato, you might actually start releasing your fingers very quickly for achieving a staccato effect. So I still move my wrist, but I just release my fingers as soon as they hit the keys. And there's a principal difference between pushing off your fingers like that, because in this case you would be tense, and just releasing them. So as you see, I just release my fingers and allow them to rest on the keys immediately. And this combination of a very quick release and this motion for each pair of chords helps me to avoid any stress. So basically you can play these figures as long as you want without getting tired.